For decades, the story told about Africa was always the same, a continent in crisis, desperate for help. And the West? They played the savior. But behind the scenes, it was never just about help. It was about control, influence, power, wrapped in the disguise of humanitarian aid. And Africa's leaders? Many of them played right along, eager handshakes, signed agreements, billions in so-called assistance, with strings attached, always. But something is shifting. In a bold, unapologetic move, the military government of Niger just told the European Union, keep your aid and take your ambassador with you. Yes, you heard that right. They kicked the EU out. But what drove this dramatic showdown? Why would a country, often painted as poor and dependent, turn its back on one of the world's most powerful alliances? Something deeper is happening here. This isn't just about money, it's about dignity. It's about reclaiming sovereignty. And Niger isn't alone. So what exactly triggered this fallout? And what does it reveal about Africa's new chapter? Let's dive into the power play that's shaking up international politics and changing the face of Africa forever. The fallout between Niger and the European Union didn't erupt overnight. It had been simmering quietly, a tension building beneath the surface. The trigger? A seemingly routine transfer of humanitarian aid, 1.3 million euros sent by the EU to assist victims of catastrophic floods in Niger. The floods had been devastating, villages submerged, hundreds of lives lost, and thousands forced from their homes. On the surface, it looked like an act of goodwill, but in reality, it ignited a storm of suspicion. Niger's military-led government didn't just accept the money blindly. They began asking questions that made Europe uncomfortable. Where exactly was this aid going? Who controlled its distribution? And more importantly, why were foreign diplomats making decisions as if Niger's own government didn't exist? Tensions reached a boiling point with the EU's ambassador to Niger, Salvador Pinto da Franca. Despite the country's political transition, he reportedly refused to engage with the new leadership, acting with a sense of superiority that echoed colonial arrogance. To Niger's leaders, this wasn't just disrespect, it was unacceptable. They demanded his replacement, but the European Union refused, so Niger took a bold step. They ordered him out. In response, the EU recalled their envoy, cutting diplomatic ties in dramatic fashion. It was more than a standoff, it was a declaration. A sovereign nation had drawn a line in the sand and dared Europe to cross it. This wasn't just about one ambassador, it was about a new Africa. An Africa that's tired of being patronized, tired of playing the obedient partner, and no longer afraid to say, enough. When the European Union announced its aid package, 1.3 million euros in emergency relief for flood victims, it sounded like a generous gesture, but beneath the surface, it was anything but simple. Instead of working alongside Niger's government, the EU took a different route. They funneled the funds directly to international NGOs operating inside the country, without a word to Niger's leadership. To many, it looked like a blatant snub, a power move. In global diplomacy, it's customary, almost sacred, for foreign aid to be coordinated with the host government. It ensures accountability, respect, and national sovereignty. So the big question loomed: why did the EU bypass Niger entirely? Why act as if the country's leaders didn't exist? The Nigerian authorities didn't stay silent. They released a firm, pointed statement accusing the EU, and specifically Ambassador Salvador Pinto da Franca, of acting unilaterally, distributing the aid through NGOs without consultation or transparency. According to the junta, this wasn't just procedural misconduct, it was a violation of trust. A line had been crossed, and they wanted answers. Niger demanded an audit of the aid. They wanted to know exactly where the money went and who controlled it. But the EU, they fired back. A spokesperson publicly expressed profound disagreement with the accusations, calling them a direct challenge to the European Union's humanitarian credibility. What began as a tragedy of nature, the flooding, had now transformed into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. And behind every press release, every carefully crafted statement, one message echoed louder than the rest. Who really holds the power when aid comes with conditions? But here's the real question. If the European Union has nothing to hide, then why resist an audit? If the funds were distributed transparently, as their spokesperson insists, then opening the books should have been a formality. Quick, simple, clean, unless it wasn't. According to Niger's authorities, they didn't just complain once and move on. Back in October, they issued a clear written warning. No humanitarian operations were to continue without a full audit. Not €1 more. not one step further, until the numbers were accounted for. But the EU's ambassador, Salvador Pinto da Franca, didn't back down. He didn't pause operations. In fact, Niger claims he did the opposite, continuing unauthorized activities, as if the warning had never been issued. To Niger's leadership, this was the last straw. In a strongly worded statement, they declared that further collaboration with the ambassador was no longer viable. They demanded his replacement, immediately, and their argument was simple but powerful. We never asked for this aid. We can handle the damage ourselves. Niger was standing on a principle: sovereignty. If help was going to come, it had to come with respect, with dialogue, with transparency. But here's what's truly striking. This kind of scenario, it's unthinkable in Western nations. Imagine a foreign power waltzing into France or Germany, handing out money without consulting the government, then refusing to explain how it's being used. It would spark outrage. Yet when it's Africa, the rules seem to change. The West often arrives not as a partner, but as a supervisor, a self-appointed guardian. They expect African governments to nod quietly, to accept funds with no questions asked, even if it means bypassing national laws and constitutional processes. But not in Niger, not this time. The military leadership has drawn a firm line in the sand. No more backdoor deals, no more silent compromises. In Niger, due process is not optional, it's mandatory. This isn't just a diplomatic disagreement, it's a stand, a message to the world. Africa is no longer playing by foreign rules. Now here is a very important question that needs to be answered. Why did the EU decide to bypass the authorities in Niger during this process? Is it because it's a military government? Are they funding something in Niger that they do not want the government to know about? Seriously, the government of Niger will need to launch an investigation into the EU's operation in Niger. Before we continue, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. This moment is more than just a disagreement over aid. It's the climax of a long-souring relationship between Niger and the West, one that began unraveling the moment General Abdourahmane Tiani stepped into power. Before Tiani, there was President Mohamed Bazoum, a man celebrated by the United States, France, and the European Union as a model African leader. But behind the Western applause was a troubling truth. Bazoum wasn't hailed because he was honest or effective. He was hailed because he was useful. To many Nigerians, Bazoum was a puppet, corrupt, detached, a leader who turned a blind eye to foreign exploitation as long as it kept him in power. And for the West, that was good enough. Under Bazoum, the United States built not one, but 2 military bases in Niger, including the largest and most expensive drone base in the entire Sahel. France, too, planted its flag with a strategic military outpost. These weren't just anti-terror efforts. These were power moves, part of a wider geopolitical chessboard with Africa as the backdrop. Then the military took over. Suddenly, the script flipped. General Tiani made it clear. Niger was not for sale. The quiet deals, the unchecked presence, the open-door policy for foreign troops, it was over. And the West? They panicked. But their outrage wasn't about democracy or military takeovers. It was about interests, oil, resources, strategic positioning, all slipping through their fingers. So they responded the way empires do when they feel threatened: sanctions. From Washington to Paris and straight through Brussels, a wave of financial punishment slammed into Niger. Assets frozen, aid blocked, diplomatic ties severed. The European Union joined the chorus, hoping pressure would bring Tiani's government to its knees. But it didn't. Instead, Niger stood tall, refusing to bow. In doing so, the nation made one thing crystal clear. This isn't just a change in government, it's a change in direction, a declaration of independence, not just from France or the EU, but from an entire system built to keep Africa in check. With tensions escalating, the European Union made its next move: sanctions. Not just symbolic statements or diplomatic warnings, real consequences. In a formal declaration, the EU Council rolled out a framework specifically designed to target Niger's military junta. According to the 27-member bloc, the new measures would allow them to impose penalties on individuals and entities responsible for threatening the peace, stability, and security of Niger. But what exactly did that mean? On paper, the sanctions would focus on those who undermine democracy, the constitutional order, or the rule of law. That included travel bans, asset freezes, and bans on financial transactions to anyone blacklisted. The message was clear: If you're in charge and not playing by our rules, we will come after you. And at the center of this campaign was Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief. Standing behind a podium, Borrell didn't mince words. Military coups bear costs, he said. He reinforced that the EU's position aligned with ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc, which had already taken a hard stance against the new leadership in Niger. According to Borrell, this was more than punishment. It was a signal to the entire region. Europe will not tolerate defiance. But here's the part many forget. This wasn't the first time the EU had cracked down on Niger. Immediately after the military took power, the European Union swiftly cut off financial support and suspended all security cooperation. No more training, no more funds, no more deals. The doors slammed shut. And yet, Niger didn't flinch. Because to the junta, this wasn't just about governance. It was about liberation. The sanctions, the condemnations, the frozen aid, they weren't signs of failure. They were signs that Niger had finally broken away from an old system, one where compliance was rewarded and independence was punished. The European Union knew exactly what it was doing. When it froze financial support to Niger, it wasn't just applying pressure, it was wielding power. You see, for years, Niger had relied heavily on Western funds to sustain its national budget. Cutting that support wasn't just a policy shift, it was meant to cripple the country's backbone. But something unexpected happened. Niger survived. In fact, the country kept going. Without the EU's money, without the aid pipelines, without Western financial lifelines. That's when things started to look suspicious. Because suddenly, after months of economic isolation, the European Union sent 1.3 million euros in humanitarian aid. Out of nowhere. No prior agreement with the government. No explanation. Just money. Routed through international NGOs, bypassing the authorities entirely. If they had already suspended aid, why this sudden gesture? It doesn't take a strategist to know something wasn't right. The timing, the method, the secrecy. It raised one burning question. Was this really about humanitarian relief, or was something else at play? And Niger's government didn't hesitate to act. A few months later, the country took another bold step. They expelled the International Committee of the Red Cross. No negotiation, no warning, just a firm declaration. Pack up and leave. The Red Cross offices in Niamey were shut down. Foreign staff were sent home. And the message was unmistakable. To the West and its allies, this move triggered alarm, outrage, confusion. They demanded answers. But Niger gave none. Why? Because it didn't need to. As Mahamadou Namaiwa Atto, a respected researcher and law lecturer at Jibo Hamani University, plainly stated, Niger owes no one an explanation. This wasn't a colony. This wasn't a puppet regime. This was a sovereign nation acting in its own interest. And for the first time in decades, Niger wasn't asking for permission. The real question isn't why Niger is shutting doors. It's why the West expected them to stay open in the first place. The West loves to wear the mask of a savior in Africa. It sends its NGOs into the continent waving the banner of humanitarianism, of compassion. But behind the polished smiles and high-level press releases lies a deeper, more calculated strategy: soft power. You see, many of these NGOs don't just hand out food or medicine. They help maintain influence. They shape the narrative. A narrative where Africa is always the needy one, always the crisis zone, always the helpless victim waiting for Western rescue. And while there are certainly NGOs with good intentions, the majority operate as quiet agents of foreign interest, tools in a much larger geopolitical game. Over the decades, these organizations have reinforced one message: Africa cannot stand on its own. But the truth is, Western aid has never been free, not once. Behind every check is a demand. Behind every donation, a condition. And more often than not, those costs are paid by the African people in lost autonomy, manipulated policy, and long-term dependence. This is why the aid system is so dangerous. It may look like charity, but it operates like a leash, and it's time to cut it. Africa must reject the narrative of permanent victimhood, because the longer it accepts aid as a lifeline, the more it is seen as weak, dependent, and incapable. This perception fuels how the West treats the continent, with pity, with contempt, and most of all, with control. If Africa is ever to rise, truly rise, it must stop begging for survival and start building toward power. And that journey begins the moment it says, no more Western aid. Here's the hard truth. The West will never stop giving aid to Africa, but not because it cares. Not truly. It's because aid has become one of the most effective tools of modern exploitation. For decades, Pan-African thinkers and economists have warned that foreign aid isn't about helping Africa grow. It's about keeping Africa dependent. Aid, they argue, doesn't build, it binds. It doesn't uplift, it undermines. Despite billions, even trillions of dollars being poured into the continent, sustainable development has remained elusive. The results? Shocking. Widespread poverty, entrenched corruption, and a generation of governments addicted to handouts instead of innovation. Even more disturbing are the accusations that aid money has fueled violence. Whispers that some of the funds flowing into Africa are ending up in the wrong hands, funding wars, financing terror, and prolonging instability. A U.S. senator even went on record, claiming that USAID money was traced to the activities of Boko Haram and other extremist groups. And while the West frames aid as a lifeline, it often arrives with strings so tight they strangle local progress. Projects get shelved, indigenous solutions are ignored, national priorities are twisted to fit Western interests and cultural agendas. The result? A system where Africans are sidelined in their own future. Economist and author Dambisa Moyo calls it out plainly in her groundbreaking book, Dead Aid. Her words are brutal, but honest. Aid is not the solution. Aid is the problem. She argues that decades of financial aid have propped up dictators, killed innovation, eroded local enterprise, and discouraged economic self-reliance. And she's not alone. Across the continent, a new wave of leaders and thinkers are beginning to echo that same call. And ironically, one of the most unexpected catalysts was President Trump's suspension of aid to Africa. What many saw as a hostile gesture, others began to see as a wake-up call. Because for the first time in a long time, African leaders were forced to confront a difficult question. What if the aid stopped? And in that question lies a radical possibility. A future where Africa is no longer the continent waiting with outstretched hands, but one that stands on its own, builds from within, and controls its own destiny. Even within Africa, voices are rising, not in defense of aid, but in defiance of it. Former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta recently broke ranks with the usual diplomatic silence and said what few African leaders have dared to admit publicly. After the Trump administration temporarily withdrew aid from the continent, a chorus of outrage followed. But Kenyatta didn't join the outcry. Instead, he challenged it. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "It's not your country. He has no reason to give you anything. You don't pay taxes in America." To him, this wasn't a crisis. It was a wake-up call. A jolt to the system, a moment for African leaders to stop begging and start building. Kenyatta didn't stop there. He urged the continent's leaders to look inward, to leverage Africa's vast natural wealth to support its people, to stop misusing resources, to stop wasting time, and to finally start laying the foundation for a future powered by African solutions. But he wasn't the only one calling out the system. Professor Kingsley Moghalu, president of the African School of Governance and former deputy governor of Nigeria's central bank, went further, calling it what it truly is, an aid industrial complex. A machine, he said, that has helped underdevelop Africa by partnering with weak, visionless leadership and fueling a culture of dependency that strips Africa of its agency. "I sympathize with the people kept afloat by this system," he admitted. "But I say to Africa, now is your time to rise." In Moghalu's view, development was never international. Not really, not anywhere. Every successful nation, every thriving economy built itself from within. Necessity, he reminds us, is the mother of invention. And for Africa, that necessity has never been clearer. This is the hour to break the cycle, to stop asking for lifelines and start creating them, to rise, not with aid, but with vision. Here's what's truly remarkable. The military-led nations of the Sahel are proving a point the world wasn't ready to hear, a point that cuts through decades of dependency, diplomacy, and deception. Africa can survive without Western aid. Take Mali, for example. Not long ago, global institutions predicted collapse after sanctions and funding freezes. But instead, Mali shocked the world, repaying over $332 million of its internal debt using its own resources. No bailout, no foreign rescue, just strategic planning and self-reliance. Burkina Faso is doing the same. Development projects, schools, roads, energy infrastructure, funded without a single cent from the West. They're not waiting for aid. They're building with what they have and for who they serve, their own people. So ask yourself, if these countries can thrive without Western help, What does that tell us? It tells us that Africa doesn't need the West. But the truth, the uncomfortable, unspoken truth, is that the West needs Africa. They know it. That's why the aid keeps flowing. Not because of generosity, not out of compassion, but because aid is the leash, a tool of influence, a strategy to maintain access to Africa's vast wealth of minerals, oil, and untapped potential. Here's the kicker. What the West gives in aid is nothing compared to what it takes. Billions leave the continent every year, disguised as corporate profits, outrageous visa fees, inflated loan interest, and exploitative trade deals. Aid is just the decoy. The real game is extraction. Africa is still, in many ways, funding the development of the rest of the world. And in return, it remains stagnant, underdeveloped, and silenced. But for how long? How long will African leaders stand by as the continent's wealth is siphoned off under the illusion of help? How long will Africa continue to trade its future for crumbs dressed up as charity? The truth is, Africa is not poor. Africa has been made poor. And if the continent finally rises, if it finally says no more, then perhaps the world will see Africa not as a problem to be solved, but as a power to be respected. Here's the truth we all need to hear. Africa already has everything it needs to thrive. Natural resources, in abundance. Human capital, unmatched. Talent, youth, innovation. It's all here. What's missing isn't foreign aid. It's vision, leadership, and the courage to break free from the illusion that Africa must depend on someone else to succeed. This is a pivotal moment in history, a turning point, a time for bold, African solutions. The era of handouts must come to an end. African leaders must rise to the challenge, rethink economic models, redirect resources, and build systems that are truly self-sufficient. Not tomorrow, not someday. Now Africa must no longer be seen, or see itself, as a beggar. It must be seen as an equal partner, a force, a continent of untapped potential ready to lead, not follow. And if anyone still doubts that this is possible, just look at the Sahel, look at Mali, look at Burkina Faso, look at Niger. These military-led governments are rewriting the rules and proving to the world that Africa doesn't need foreign aid to survive. It only needs the will to rise. Because here's the paradox. Aid didn't help Africa. It crippled it. It painted the continent as helpless, when in fact, it was simply unleashing its own strength. Take the aid away, and Africa will do what it's always done when left with no choice. Adapt, innovate, rise. No more cheap food that kills local agriculture. No more development loans that buy debt instead of progress. No more false charity wrapped in hidden costs. When aid disappears, Africa will be forced to build real farms, real roads, real industry, and real trade, not with the West, but with itself. And from that, a new Africa will be born, stronger, prouder, and truly independent. So, what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in Africa's potential, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks we need to beg to survive.